It's official. Ukraine now has the green light to strike inside Russia. Not just occupied Ukrainian territory, inside actual Russian territory. For Putin, this changes everything. On May 26th, Germany's new chancellor stood in front of the cameras and said it plainly. There are no longer any range restrictions. The US, UK, France, and Germany are done holding back. That means Russia's air bases, weapons depots, and command centers, once considered untouchable, are now fair game. And the Kremlin, it's panicking. So what weapons can Ukraine now unleash on Russian soil? And how could this escalate the war or finally tip it? Let's break it down. This means that Ukraine can now defend itself, for example, by attacking military positions in Russia, with very few exceptions. It didn't do that until recently. It can now do that. The news may come as a surprise to those who remember that the UK and US allowed Ukraine to use their long-range missiles to strike Russian targets back in November of last year. The former allowed Ukraine to use Storm Shadow, with the latter permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles to attack Russia. The key difference lies in the specific kinds of targets Ukraine was allowed to hit back in November. Yes, it could hit Russian positions with its Western missiles. However, those Russian positions either had to be inside occupied Ukrainian territory or at best in the border regions where Putin was preparing attacks against Ukraine. That meant Ukraine couldn't, for example, use a Storm Shadow to attack a military base deeper inside Russia that provided no immediate threat to Ukraine. It can. And Putin is terrified. We know that much from the Kremlin's response to the news. Rather than attempting to shrug it off, Russia has come out to say that the decision made by Ukraine's Western allies is both dangerous and detrimental to any efforts those allies are attempting to make to help Ukraine and Russia reach a peace agreement. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, outlined Russia's response. If these decisions have indeed been made, Peskov said, they are completely at odds with our aspirations for a political settlement. That's a veiled twofold warning from the Kremlin. Russia appears to be threatening to pull out of peace talks, using Ukraine's new ability to use Western-made long-range missiles as its leverage. Worse yet, Peskov is implying that Russia may be forced to escalate the Ukraine war further as a response. We'll discuss what that may mean later in the video. In truth, the West's decision shouldn't come as a surprise. It comes on the back of Russia launching its largest series of drone strikes against Ukraine yet. Also on May 26th, The Guardian reported that Russia had engaged in 3 consecutive nights of drone strikes against Ukraine, killing at least 6 people in the process. The night of the 26th offered up the worst of it, with Russia sending a record-breaking 355 of its Iran-supplied Shahed drones to Ukraine, along with 9 of its cruise missiles. Ukraine's Air Force spokesperson Yuri Ignat confirmed the attack was the largest drone strike Russia had launched against Ukraine since Putin started his full-scale invasion in February 2022. The response to Russia's escalation was immediate, with US President Donald Trump lambasting Putin for his decision. Something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy, Trump blared on his Truth Social platform. I've always said he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it. And maybe that's proving to be right, but if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. While that post may be encouraging to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky from the perspective of Ukraine receiving more US support, Trump didn't leave Zelensky out of his response. He claimed that Ukraine's leader is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. The Kremlin subtly mocked Trump for his statements. It claimed that Trump's words were the result of an emotional overload, suggesting that Putin is still trying to manipulate Trump to his agenda. France's President Emmanuel Macron took a different approach, noting that he believes Trump now realizes that Putin is playing him and that the anger Trump is expressing on social media translates into action. That appears to be precisely what happened. The US, along with 3 other countries, has lifted restrictions on how Ukraine uses the long-range missiles provided to it by the West. Is that an escalation? Perhaps. But Russia showed on Monday that it's already escalating its aerial strikes, making the decision by the 4 nations as much as a response to Putin's aggression as anything else. After all, Putin is being a hypocrite. He's claiming that Ukraine attacking Russia on its own territory will slow down peace talks out of one side of his mouth, while remaining silent over Russia's constant attacks on Ukraine out of the other side. Coming back to Germany and Merz's comments, the German Chancellor offered a justification for his country's decision. He says that Ukraine can only be placed in a position to properly defend itself if the country's allies finally stop holding it back. We call it in the jargon long-range fire, which is to say to equip Ukraine with weapons with which it can strike at military goals beyond its borders, Merz said. Germany's Chancellor also pointed out that Ukraine will use its missiles far differently from Russia. He says the decisive difference between the military leadership of the aggressor, Russia, and Ukraine, whilst the latter has military goals in its sights, Russia is targeting civilians. Therein lies the real reason why the West is finally lifting its restrictions on Ukraine. Too many Ukrainian civilians are being killed by a Russian leader who pretends that he wants peace. With these missiles, Ukraine can finally start attacking the facilities Russia uses to build and store these weapons that Putin is using to kill the country's people. As for Putin's talk about this escalation slowing the wheels of peace, Merz simply had this to say. After the last 3 weeks, no one can seriously accuse us of not having exhausted all available diplomatic means. If even an offer to meet at the Vatican does not get Putin's approval, then we must be prepared for this war to last longer than we all wish or can imagine, Merz said. In other words, the West now knows for sure that Putin was simply delaying peace talks so he could continue his assaults against Ukraine. Now Russia's leader is about to find out what that gets him. Ukraine isn't about to raise the white flag. Instead, it's now in a position where it can hit Russia where it really hurts. The question is simple. What weapons does Ukraine have from the West that it can use to strike Russian targets inside Russia itself? The answer, at least from Germany, still isn't clear. Despite all of his exclamations, Merz still wouldn't be drawn on whether Germany would be providing any of its powerful Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Little seems to have changed for Germany in that regard. Its former Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, flat out refused to provide Taurus to Ukraine, believing that doing so would escalate the war. Merz claimed that he would deliver those missiles if he came to office. However, Merz has been a little more cautious with his rhetoric since becoming Germany's chancellor. He has his reasons, he claims. Merz notes that Putin speaks German fluently, so any messages that Merz delivers publicly need to be carefully considered so they don't give too much away to Russia's leader. In other words, Merz doesn't want Putin and his cronies to figure out what Ukraine is capable of doing simply by watching a TV interview. Reading between the lines, these statements tell us that Germany is likely on the verge of delivering Taurus to Ukraine. It just isn't ready to tell anybody. So if Taurus is coming to Ukraine, what does that missile deliver now that Ukraine has no usage restrictions? A modular air-launched cruise missile, Taurus was conceived in the 1990s and entered service in 2005. Since then, there have been multiple variations of the missile, including the Taurus KEPD-350, which is the original, a shorter-range Taurus KEPD-150, and even versions that have been configured for use by other militaries. It's likely to be the Taurus KEPD-350 that Ukraine will receive from Germany, and that missile is terrifying to Putin. Germany's cruise missile has a sleek and streamlined design that's intended to make it difficult to spot by enemy radars, while also improving the weapon's aerodynamic efficiency. It measures 16.7 feet long and weighs a little over 3,200 pounds, suggesting a substantial payload that's capable of devastating the protected structures Russia uses to guard its missile stockpiles. Taurus comes packed with Germany's Mephisto penetrator warhead, which is a two-stage tandem warhead designed to dig its way into protected structures. The idea is simple. Mephisto's first stage, also known as its pre-charge, creates a breach in a target's defenses, including armor and solid concrete. That breach offers a gap large enough for the second stage, which comprises a high-energy explosive charge, to enter the target itself. Once there, the second stage detonates from the inside of the target, ensuring maximum damage. In practice, this makes Taurus similar to the Javelin missiles Ukraine has used so effectively to take out Russia's tanks. However, Mephisto is far more special than that. Army Recognition says the warhead has both void sensing and layer counting technology built in. What that means is that Mephisto can figure out whether it's reached the appropriate point for a detonation. For instance, let's assume that Ukraine uses a Taurus to strike a 3-story weapons storage facility. The weapons themselves are on the bottom floor, with the top 2 floors being administrative area. With its layer counting tech, Mephisto knows how to break through the top 2 floors of the structure to reach the weapons on the bottom floor before it detonates. That means Putin can't hide Ukraine's most desired targets away. He can bury them, he can hide them in multi-story buildings. None of it will matter, because Mephisto is smart enough to make its way through any barriers Russia attempts to create so it can destroy its target. Of course, this sheer destructive force wouldn't mean much if the Taurus missile wasn't capable of striking targets at long range and at speed. Taurus has both these issues covered. The missile is capable of moving at just shy of the speed of sound, hitting a maximum speed of Mach 0.9. While that's not quite fast enough to completely outpace Russia's air defense systems, it will likely do the job if Ukraine combines its Taurus strikes with decoy drones sent to confuse those defenses. On the range front, Taurus can travel up to 310 miles before touching down on its target. That means that it has one of the longest ranges of any Western-supplied missiles Ukraine has, which naturally opens up more opportunities for attacks. Russia can't even rely on jamming technology to send the Taurus off course. Germany's missile combines GPS and an inertial navigation system, or INS, to find its way during its mid-course trajectory. A terrain-referenced navigation system also allows Taurus to plot a course to its target in which it won't confront air defense systems. Plus, as the missile enters its terminal guidance phase, an infrared seeker activates that ensures it can identify and engage its target while fending off any Russian attempts to jam the missile's GPS. All told, Taurus is a powerful missile that rightly has Putin running scared. But even if Germany doesn't hand that missile over just yet, Russia's military installations aren't safe. The lifting of restrictions by the US, UK, and France means that Russia now also has to deal with ATACMS and Storm Shadow. ATACMS, which is made by the US, is a short-range tactical ballistic missile, though that still means it has a solid range in the context of how Ukraine wants to use it. It measures 13 feet long, making it larger than the Taurus, and can weigh up to 3,700 pounds, depending on the variant. It's fast, too, capable of hitting speeds of Mach 3, which means it can avoid many of Russia's air defense systems. Guided by a combination of GPS and INS, the missile has a top range of 186 miles, so it can't quite travel as far as Germany's Taurus, but it packs an even more explosive punch against its target. Storm Shadow, or Scalp to give the missile its French name, is just as dangerous. The export version of the missile has a maximum range of 155 miles, though it's possible that Ukraine has received the domestic versions of the missile that are capable of reaching twice that distance. The missile comes packed with a 992-pound Broach warhead, which stands for Bomb Royal Ordnance Augmented Charge. Like Mephisto, this warhead uses a two-stage approach to first penetrate a target's outer layer before sending explosive destruction into the target itself. Storm Shadow can travel at speeds of up to Mach 0.95 depending on its altitude, and again like the Taurus, it's a cruise missile fired from a fighter jet. Assuming Ukraine receives the Taurus, it's going to get a trio of missiles it can use to hit Russia hard. Here's what that means for the Ukraine war. First, more targets are now open to Ukraine than ever before. Merz made that clear with his announcement, adding that lifting restrictions on these missiles will make the decisive difference in Ukraine's war. Why? Well, Merz explained that too, saying, "A country that can only oppose an attacker on its own territory is not defending itself adequately." The implication here is that Ukraine can defend itself far better if it can hit Russian targets inside Russia itself. That ability opens up opportunities for Ukraine to take out Russian ammunition depots, logistical centers, and even entire military bases, which in turn relieves pressure on the areas of Ukraine Putin is currently Back in August 2024, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, highlighted just how many targets are now in Ukraine's crosshairs. Back then, the ISW said that Ukraine's ATACMS gave it the ability to hit at least 245 Russian targets, including 16 air bases. That alone is massive. Russia uses its air bases to launch devastating glide bombs at Ukraine's cities and infrastructure. Having the ability to take those bases out of commission would be huge for Ukraine. We also can't ignore the fact that Taurus, assuming it's coming to Ukraine, offers over 100 miles more range than ATACMS. We don't know for certain how many more Russian bases and military structures that larger range opens up as targets. But the takeaway here is that several hundred of Putin's most valuable military assets now face a massive threat. The lifting of long-range missile restrictions also means that Ukraine can finally hit Russia hard in response to the many attacks Putin has ordered against Ukraine's cities. Merz suggested himself when noting the difference between Ukraine and Russia's strategies. Germany's chancellor said that Russia ruthlessly attacks civilian targets, bombing cities, kindergartens, hospitals, and elderly care homes. Ukraine does not do this, and we attach great importance to keeping it that way. Merz isn't wrong. The massive drone strike we mentioned earlier in Kyiv is just the tip of the iceberg for Putin's brutal civilian targeting strategy. Russia's attempts to create terror inside Ukraine have so far led to its missiles, drones, and glide bombs, killing at least 13,134 civilians between February 24, 2022 and April 30, 2025. Of those more than 13,000 dead, 701 are children. Russia's terrible attacks have also injured 31,867 people, including 2,032 children. Therein lies the secondary goal of permitting Ukraine to attack Russian targets inside Russia with Western long-range missiles. Yet those attacks on Russia's bases and ammunition stockpiles will relieve pressure on Ukraine's frontline forces. However, they'll also minimize Putin's ability to target people who aren't even involved in the fighting. The missiles aren't a cure-all for Putin's civilian targeting approach. However, they're powerful enough to make it much harder for Russia's leader to terrorize Ukrainian civilians as often as he has. There's only one thing that Ukraine and the West have to worry about: potential Russian escalation. Peskov has already indicated that the combined decision by Germany, the US, the UK, and France is a major blow to peace talks. In truth, none will take that threat seriously. Putin has done everything in his power to avoid creating a ceasefire agreement or any form of peace treaty that doesn't call for the total eradication of Ukraine as a sovereign entity. Despite the best efforts of the US and Ukraine, peace doesn't seem any more likely an option now than it was before Trump became the US president. More worrying, at least for the West, is that the decision to lift restrictions means Russia may start accusing the four countries involved of direct participation in the Ukraine war. Moscow hinted at that likelihood when it warned that Germany allowing Ukraine to use Taurus to strike Russia's transport infrastructure could amount to this direct participation. Given these statements, we have to consider something important. Russia's nuclear doctrine. When the US first permitted Ukraine to use ATACMS to strike Russian targets in occupied Ukrainian territory, Putin responded by signing into law a new Russian nuclear doctrine. Among the tweaks Russia made was the inclusion of language suggesting that Russia could now respond with nuclear weapons to the launch of ballistic missiles attacking the territory of the Russian Federation and/or its allies. ATACMS is a ballistic missile. Russia also claims that it can now target a country that uses conventional weapons that threaten its sovereignty, which covers Storm Shadow and the Taurus. But most worrying of all, Russia's new nuclear doctrine says that it can use nuclear weapons both against the country attacking it and any country providing its opponents with the means to hit Russia's territory. Translation: Russia's doctrine says it can escalate to nuclear warfare against Ukraine and its allies if missiles like Taurus and ATACMS are used on Russian territory. Now, saying that this could happen and actually following through on it are two very different things. Putin knows that the US, UK, and France all have nuclear arsenals with which they would respond to any Russian nuclear strike. Still, it's the threat of escalation that's more concerning. The signing of this new nuclear doctrine was intended to intimidate Ukraine's allies into backing away from allowing Putin's enemy to use their missiles on its territory. That threat worked for a few months, but now Germany, the US, the UK, and France have decided the benefits of permitting Ukraine to hit Russia with long-range missiles far outweigh the risks. That decision may change the entire direction of the war. But what do you think about the lifting of restrictions on Ukraine's usage of long-range missiles? Is Taurus finally going to make its way to Ukraine? How will Ukraine use its Western-made missiles to hurt Russia? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war.